Welcome, everybody, and glad for you to join this. I'll be short. I'm Michelle Reeb. I co-direct the Workplace Mental Health Solutions with Sagar Parikh. I was also a past president of the APA, and I'm professor here in the Department of Psychiatry and at Eisenberg Family Depression Center here at the University of Michigan. So excited to have Sierra Gillison here with us this afternoon. Sierra joined LYRA in 2020 as the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at LYRA Health. Previous to that, she was Assistant Director for Student Life at Stanford University, at Graduate School of Business, where she championed student identity, group engagement. I'm so glad that you're going to be with us, Sierra, to talk to us about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So thank you. Take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for everyone for attending and for your patience with seeing my charming face. So I will share screen here, and let's see, get started. So I'll start by saying I've had a very interesting career and trajectory in terms of DEIB. I've only worked at college universities for most of my career, and transitioning to LYRA was my first dose of corporate culture. And so I have lots of experience in working in the higher education space. I have lots of experience working in collegiate athletics, which is what I was doing in the higher education space. And I really hope that this presentation serves as an entry point and a dialogue to a bigger conversation that we've been having today around the intersection of DEIB and mental health. So as you see here, DEIB has this, in my viewpoint, this really unique component to mental health. As we heard from our keynote speaker today, a lot of what impacts employee well-being and the workplace mental health comes down to community. And I find that really interesting because a big part of my work is about the inclusion and belonging factor and how much inclusion and belonging impacts people's sense of community. So this is me with a different hairdo, but highlighting that mental health and DEIB are essential and that they are so much interconnected. And what I hope to do today is to leave you with a couple of highlights of things you can actually do. So notes that you can take, things that you can actually apply, and answer any questions that you may have as a result of this conversation. So let's jump into it. Where can you start, right? So there's so many different opportunities to think about what's your employee makeup. A lot of the conversations that I've heard thus far today is understanding like your company culture and what community or belonging looks like within that culture. From a DEIB component, one of the first ways you can start to address this is understanding who's at your organization and what community means to them. So an entry point here could be a demographic survey. So a lot of organizations have a EEOC information that they have to fill in. And so this would be an expansion of that, of just understanding who makes up your company culture, how do they feel about the organization, and then being able to eventually look at your data sets by different identity metrics to get a better understanding of, okay, when we're considering inclusion and belonging at our organization, who is experiencing that at a higher level and who is not experiencing that. But a first step here would be to consider what are your data sources. A lot of people think about how hard it is to collect demographic information, and it is. It can be a lift. It requires a lot of trust. Another theme that came from the previous session of like, do people feel comfortable with what you're going to do with that data? And so a action item I encourage folks to consider today is identify what your data sources are. So do they live exclusively in your employee relations or HR systems? What data do you have? And where are there gaps? Keep in mind that information is data. So if you've done listening groups with subsets or populations across the organization, that is data. So start with what you have and start to use what you have to identify what gaps exist and what stories or trends you're starting to see based off of the information that you have. From a company perspective, let me move my window. There we go. Where are we at and where are we headed? Being very transparent about our diversity metrics was empowering and was very profound in terms of the transparency across the organization. we are in a really good place, but we still have a long way to go. So this is a quote from one of our partners who talked about how important it was to understand the baseline, and in understanding the baseline, know where you're starting and begin building your roadmap for your longer term vision. A secondary tip for you is build a strong retention culture for underrepresented employees first. So what this means, again, we talked a lot about what community looks like. And what I ask us all to consider is, what does community look like for your historically marginalized community members? So if you were to go to the populations at your organization that are the least represented, what would they say about what keeps them there? What is their motivation? A lot of the conversation and dialogue today is centered on trust, again, and this concept of psychological safety, and really working with your HR teams to define what psychological safety means for your work environment. For me, it's an interesting dynamic. I work at a mental health tech startup, and where my role sits is in human resources. And so I am always a proponent and advocate, or are we, the internal culture, a part of what we're selling in terms of our business? And that's about what psychologically safety looks like to other Lyrians across the organization. So pro tip, consider how DEIB practices inform a psychologically safe work environment. For us, that's been an emphasis on manager training and development. What we know is mid-managers have a lot of emphasis and a lot of time with the majority of an employee base. And so how do managers and employees directly interact? And when you know those stories from your underrepresented groups, you get a better understanding of what's working and what might need a shift. We have this quote from the vice president of marketing at Facebook, where having a really focused talent management program and employee resource groups for underrepresented individuals is important. You can build awareness of opportunities at the company and bring people in through intent. But if employees don't see clear paths focused on progression, recognition, and advancement for people who look like them, you're going to have a retention problem. So the other piece of this, I would say, in the consideration is, do people see that they have long-term success at your organization? And if they do, that's a part of their mental health and their inclusion at your organization. The third tip I offer is to provide a safe space for employees to have deep conversation about DEIB at work. Thread here around community and how do people have a sense of belonging with one another. Initiative that I started while at Stanford in the midst of very much a lot of social unrest with my colleagues, so not with students, with my immediate peers, where we had these intentional conversations. And the idea there was, you're in community with people that you work with every day. They're a big part of what makes up your day-to-day safety and security. And so a lot of times for me at that time, I was the only Black woman in that office. And I was curious about how the social unrest was impacting my other peers, and was it having the impact on them that it was having on me? And could I feel safe to have the moments of emotional transparency with them about like what was impacting how I was coming to work and my sense of safety at work? And what that did was opened up a really deep and meaningful dialogue with myself and peers, where there was definite discourse and welcomed discourse, but a sense of being able to understand what people are bringing into the workspace and what we're carrying when we're showing up in our day-to-day life. And as a result of this is something that I've brought with me to Lyra, and it's a space that we hold monthly across our employees to really just understand how different things that are going on in the world are impacting the day-to-day of Lyra. An example here being was a topic on professionalism. So we had some employees raising some concerns also in a hybrid work environment, also in a really stratified workforce around like what is professionalism and what is appropriate to wear to work and what is not. And so we facilitated a discussion about it. The HR team was very much in the weeds of building a policy and was really ready to launch it. And my suggestion was, how about we listen to Lyrians and just see what they're thinking, feeling, and not that, we will agree with everything that the organization is saying, but rather let's get insight before we implement something and make sure people feel like they have a voice in that process. And so just an example of ways that you can involve your employee base in the decisions that you're making that will increase their sense of psychological safety and trust, knowing that you have an interest in their viewpoint, their experiences, and how that contributes to their broader work experience. Not everyone's a facilitator. I get that. So it can be hard to navigate and set up space to facilitate these kinds of conversations. The key tip I'll say to you all is silence is information. So many times I'm coaching my team through, we'll be hosting a dialogue and the room will just fall silent. And there's this angst and this insecurity that us as facilitators, are all feeling of like, did I say the wrong thing or have I offended someone? And those are all completely reasonable feelings to have. And what I've also learned in many instances is that silence is information. Many times, weeks later, someone will reach out and say like, I really didn't have the words for it at that time, but by way of that intentional conversation, I was able to think about this piece differently of my work. So just a pro tip for you all, if you're new to facilitating or if you're encouraging teams in their facilitation, sit with that silence and have it be as information for you as well. It has to go deeper than water cooler chat because there are issues are deeper. This is a moment where we can talk and have deeper conversations to have an evolution or revolution. So a lot of times people have had this pressure, myself included, to put their work face on, and their work face is very different than their day-to-day space. And much of what's happening in the work culture now is this invitation for authenticity at work. And so if we're going to continue with that invitation, are we willing as cross different organizations to go into those deeper levels of conversations and sit with what people are holding in their day-to-day? A fourth tip I'll offer is redefining professionalism in the workplace. So this was for us a direct result of those intentional conversations. But what it did do is have us as an HR or people team thinking more strategically about what does professionalism mean here? And so I ask you to consider that for your organizations. It won't look the same. A lot of, again, the dialogue today talked about the difference of industries. I work at a mental health tech startup. I came from institutions which were very much steeped, enriched in traditions and ways of working. So when I came to Lyra and there was just this willingness to try new things, it was a shift for me. So understanding what the limitations or the culture is of your organization, start with what makes most sense for you. The best way, or one of the ways you can do this, is revisiting policies. So look at what's in place and what's written. That's in a lot of ways what people are held to when there's times of conflict. So revisit your policies with a lens of intent versus impact. In many ways, most employees or employers are trying to ensure safety, physical safety, psychological safety. And so many times policies or this idea of professionalism is written with that in mind. My question to you is, whose version of professionalism are you elevating? And is there a way to have a bigger or broader understanding of what professionalism might look like at your organizations? So as Sean mentioned in the panel, invite your ERGs or your employee resource groups or your wellness groups or other groups that exist at your organization to a dialogue to understand, like, hey, we have these policies in place, but how are they actually impacting you? And what does this mean for the day-to-day employee experience? There's not a single mold for what looks professional. This should be a competency built for all employees and managers, that how people show up will vary and that the definition of professional doesn't fit what you see in the mirror. I really love this quote. It's a big part of how I ended up in this work. Most of the time I wanted to be able to come to work and do my job, but I felt like so many parts of my identities preceded my ability to do that. And so this conversation about professionalism helped me in my appearance and even in my demeanor feel more comfortable coming into a workplace with all aspects and nuances of myself. And so again, all of those things were impacting my mental health. I remember changing my hair for interviews or changing my glasses for different spaces. And so all of those things created an angst about whether or not this work environment is a place, whether this community in which I work in is where I can be my full and true authentic self. This one is a little bit of a hot topic, so buckle in my seatbelt here. But as we all know, in 2020, in the US, we faced a lot of broad and big conversations about racial stress and trauma. And what it brought up is, what's the role of the workplace when these types of issues come up? And so this for us was really an opportunity to evaluate what our benefits look like for employees and who has access to the level of support they need based on what's going on around them. So a secondary part of the conversation I've heard today is about the access to care. So it's one thing to create a psychologically safe and mentally well workplace, and it's an entirely different thing to have the resources available to employees outside of your own systems that are part of their workplace experience that meet their needs. So evaluating what your benefits empower or what your benefits say about your employee culture. Evaluating your EAP, consider what levels of support your programs provide to those who come from historically marginalized backgrounds. So at LYRA, all Lyrians have access to the LYRA benefit. And in that, part of the other half of my job is ensuring that that benefit is inclusive. So it's one thing to have access to a provider. It's an entirely different thing to have access to a provider that can sit with racial stress and trauma or LGBTQIA identity or transgender identity. So making sure that when you're choosing your benefits, that you're thinking about the demographic information that you have and who's at your organization and what's going to set them up for success when the organization isn't at the ability to meet that specific need. Where are you able to refer them out with support that is a part of your benefit program? So this quote comes back from 2020 when organizations were having lots of serious conversations about systemic racism. A comment that still remains true today is, what is the role of the workplace when it comes to a variety of issues? And as you're navigating that for yourselves and making those decisions, consider how your benefits reinforce or negate what you have put in front of folks as your values. The last tip I'll leave you with today is to support employees' mental health as a part of your DEIB initiatives. So again, many of us are coming to work with all types of stories, experiences, lived day-to-day experiences. These cameras and the idea of Zoom and a hybrid workforce brought that to light in ways that many people had never experienced before. And so understanding that people's identity, the representation across your organization, how your compensation policies or how your ERGs or different engagement opportunities are set up impact that sense of belonging. And so this is just a call to action of reevaluating your company values and seeing how much DEIB is centered in that process. A lot of times people think of this work as exclusive to like specific populations. And my approach to it has been, this is not just about Black and brown bodies or people who have marginalized identities. It's about when you are centering folks who want to come to work and belong, and you're creating a company culture that centers that as well. Are you reflecting it back? Or are you standing by what you say? And one of the ways you can do that is really support your DEIB function. One thing I really love about this role is I'm very much integrated into our people systems and programs. So I get to do a lot of how we're reinventing policies or how we're navigating our employee relations space. And then I'm also very much ingrained in our product. So I'm very much a part of when anybody who's interacting with care for the very first time, or anyone who doesn't have a history of access to mental health care interacts with the LYRA product, how is this going to land for them? It doesn't mean we're perfect. I am absolutely far from perfect, but this idea that DEIB as a core value permeates at our organization. And so my invitation to you is asking you, what permeates at your organization as the company value? So for my colleague who works in our culturally responsive care team, the ethics of mental health practices lends itself to DEIB. If your environment has DEIB, you're mitigating psychological harm. It's important to destigmatize mental health and DEIB. People get afraid of talking about both. You need to approach DEIB and wrap your arms around it. You can't do that without mental health. Both of these things are necessary. So I'll conclude before going into questions with this, encouraging you to the building strong DEIB initiatives will impact your entire organization in the long term. Over time, employers can expect evolving salient identities, attitudes, and expectations from employees related to their company's support for both DEIB and mental health initiatives. So again, the question for you is, what do you want to communicate to your organization about their values? And if DEIB is one of them, these are some of the ways that you can start to reflect that. A quote from yours truly, and then I'm happy to take any questions.
So, Sierra, that was just a wonderful, wonderful presentation. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for bearing with us with a little minor technical issues. I was really struck by the term DEIB. We don't call it that in our organization here at the University of Michigan. We call it DEI. So let me start off with that. Did you start that, or did you hear about that from some other organization? Please let us know how that evolved.
Yes, I love that question, Michelle. And it's actually a big part of the reason why I chose LYRA. Belonging, so the language around diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice is evolving. It always has been. So many folks will remember that diversity initiatives started in terms of like legality and making sure that people had the right structures in place to support employees and not get sued. And we've evolved into we want to move beyond not getting sued. We want to move towards like, does everyone feel like they can be a part of this space? And so that's really what the belonging or the B represents. And if I'm looking at any roles, I'm always looking for that B, because to me, the D, the E, the I are all how you contribute to this sense of belonging and this idea of community that this conference is centering today. You can have diversity, you can have representation across your organization. You can be working really hard to have equitable practices, and you can be creating spaces for people to have seats at tables. For me, that represents your diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the belonging piece is about, do I want to stay here? Can I show up here and feel like I'm a part of this space in ways that is deeply and meaningful to me?
That's a great answer. And I think it shows the total interconnection between DEIB and mental health at organizations and why they're both so integral and important. In fact, some organizations are just adding mental health to DEI, and it really is separate. But I like the way you were able to connect them. Before I forget, somebody asked in the question, how do people connect with you? How do they get hold of you?
Yes.
And connect with you. So
I would say the best or fastest way to reach me is through my LinkedIn. So please feel free to send me a LinkedIn invite and make mention of this conference as where you have seen me. My inbox is wild. So if you email me, it'll get lost in the shuffle. So the best way to connect with me would be through my LinkedIn.
great. Or just connect with us here through Workplace Solutions, and we can hook you up together. So a question comes from one of our participants. The question is, how do you suggest evaluating an organization's EAP? Are there best practices of standards that we can use in evaluating theirs?
I love that question. I would start with the broader question of, do you feel like your current EAP offerings align with your organizational values? So I would take like your broader mission statements, the things that you tell people at new hire orientation, the things that are all over your website. As you look at those things and you look at the details of your EAP, do they align? And if they do, great, you're on the right track. And if you're seeing where there are gaps, there's an opportunity. I would say a secondary piece, and this one's loaded because it means you're listening to lots of other people's opinions. And a lot of times when you open the door to opinions, you then get flooded with people that expect change right away. But what you could do is just ask your employee base, like, how has your experience been with our EAP? I'll speak from my own personal experience in higher education spaces, much like was mentioned in the panel. Great resources available. You call a therapist, they don't have availability for 10 months. And so if you're in an immediate crisis and that crisis is impacting how that employee is showing up at work, is that EAP really serving the need of your organization and that employee in the ways that you intend? So first suggestion is big picture strategic vision of looking at your company values and comparing them up against what your EAP offers. The secondary piece would be meeting with employees, so offering different subgroups to come together and talk about their experience, their lived day-to-day experience utilizing the EAP.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what in your view would be the best way to review policies in order to ensure that they are DEI, JEDI belonging compliant?
One more time, Michelle. Ask me that question one more time. I'm
Yeah,
shy.
it's a wordy question. So what in your view would be the best way to review policies in order to ensure that they are DEI, JEDI / belonging compliant?
Great question. So I would borrow the same framing is like, when you mean compliant, are you talking about compliant from a broader, like I individual care about DEI and therefore I want my organization to reflect it in this way? Or at the organizational level, has your organization made a statement as it pertains to DEI? And I would say if it has, that is the best way to align for compliance. So we said this, we're doing this. Is it an overlay or are we experiencing more of a seesaw? And so if there is a statement that your organization made, many organizations made them in 2020, what do they look like today? Are you still living by those statements? Are they in the dusty drawer of a cabinet? Or are they a big part of what your organization is still highlighting day to day? If you've never had a statement at your organization and you want to be a part of like what it means to have one, I'm a huge proponent, again, of aligning it to your organizational values. A lot of DEIB programs are suffering now because they have disjointed or they have values that don't necessarily show how they are completely and directly aligned with the organization's values. For instance, at LIRA, we want to develop quality mental health care. Well, what I've made sure of in terms of navigating the DEIB alignment is that a part of having quality healthcare is having culturally responsive healthcare. And in doing so, I make sure that our DEI strategy lines up nicely to what we're trying to serve to customers and clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it always surprises me. You know, I remember once it was coming down one of the elevators in our hospital, and there was a big quote up there, what our major mission was. And a few years later, that sign came down. And I was thinking, what does that mean when a value like that comes down? Does that mean that we don't really care about that anymore? Or how does that change? And, it's about leadership and communication and, making sure that we're all on the same page, I think. It's not a de jour value. It has to be baked in, right?
And it's not easy, right? Because many employees, myself included, when I was at Stanford, I wanted Stanford to say something about everything. If it meant something to me personally, why wasn't my employer saying something about it? And as I sit in a role now where I'm a big part of how the organization makes those decisions, I see how complex it is. You don't want to be an organization that speaks to everything. You want to speak to things that are aligned with who you are and what you value. But I'll come back to what you said, Michelle, is like to me, the greatest sense of authenticity you can have is not in what you say, but what you do and your alignment in what you do day to day that showcases how much you're valuing, in this case, DEIB as a component to anyone's mental health.
Right. So here's a following up on what you just said, Sarah. How do you navigate making DEIB accessible to everyone across organizations where there is a wide range of engagement and awareness so that everyone feels empowered to ensure everyone does belong?
Tricky, not easy. It's a great question. To me, it starts with what level of support do you have at your most upward level of the organization and at your day-to-day level of the organization. So for me, a big part of why I was able to do my job at LIRA is I knew that our CEO would scream his support for DEI at the top of his his lungs, excuse me. So like, it's one of the reasons that at LIRA, it's essentially like, this is what we believe, and this is how we're going to do our job. It's a core part of what we do in our day-to-day. And so for anyone that's not how they operate, they find themselves really at an odds of like, this is a conflict. And so for me, My job is to alleviate the conflict, right? To understand what the conflict is. And in most cases, people have conflict with what they don't understand, or they have conflict with something that feels like it's exclusive or exclusionary of them. And so what I have tried to do my best at, and again, not perfect, completely and incredibly flawed, is to make sure that everyone sees themselves as a part of the process. So that's what the intentional conversations have done. Honestly, it's been a place for someone to raise the question like this person has raised, and to hear from the group, not just me. I can give an opinion, but other people are able to offer voices into the space, which contribute to someone in that room hearing something that they didn't say themselves, but they feel encouraged by a fellow peer at Lyra saying it in a way that they didn't necessarily say.
A great answer. You know, you mentioned before that at Stanford there was difficulties that you saw in DEIB, and then the position at Lyra, you know, was available. I was just wondering personally, you know, did you find that very personally challenging at Stanford? It's a big organization, and you know it's not perfect either. But you know, maybe you have more control over what you're doing at Lyra, and maybe that's helpful.
Yeah, I'll say I'm probably mid-career, and so a big part of my journey at Stanford and my journey in life has been like, and this is a big question, but like, what is the role of the workplace, right? Like, am I supposed to go to work and feel like I'm with my best friends, or am I supposed to go to work and it feel like work? And a lot of times my experience at Stanford was really like this internal conflict I was having with myself about how authentically can I show up here when I'm the only person that looks like me. And so this to me goes back to the diversity component and the DEIB of representation matters. I don't think it's innately anyone's intention to make me feel a way about being in that space. But I inadvertently felt a way because I was the only one showing up with hair that looked like this, or like different experiences that I was having in my day-to-day. So I'll say that Stanford has made a lot of progress and has been a big part of how I have made my own growth in tradition and trajectory, and changes that they've made at that organization by result of not just my influence, but students encouraging them to think more critically about how they're approaching diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. There's a function within that program now that's focusing on that. So the struggle brings change. And so for me, that experience was a part of elevating something at that place that I've left differently because of my willingness to vocalize what was going on for me.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that might probably resonate with a lot of folks. People are saying that they tried to
My
connect on
LinkedIn, yeah, okay.
and they need your email. So I don't know what will be best.
If I drop it in the chat here, will you be able to share it? So I'll say it. It's C and then GI, my last name, LLISON, and then .2@gmail.com. I made it when I was like 18, so give me some grace there. But right. CGILLI. I'll drop it in the space I have here, and then the team should feel free to copy it for
Thank you, because a lot of people are trying to reach you, so that's great. I think we had time for one more question. So this is a long question. Any tips for a workforce whose mission makes it difficult to access or maintain services? For example, if folks working in remote settings due to jurisdiction issues with mental health providers won't continue services when the employee works across states.
Ooh, so this sounds like how do you provide some level of consistency when the organization isn't set up in a way that acknowledges that? My top of mind thought is like the advocacy component. So who are the people that you can continue to raise this challenge to? And how can you continue to explain that this is having a detrimental impact on the workforce? So it is about who you can speak to that has the weight and ability to make the level of change that you're trying to make. And how do you gain support in that? So like if this is, if you know this to be true, what data points can you collect and gather and share with the decision makers on how this is negatively impacting the workforce, and look for partners, be it benefit partners or what have you, that are designed to support a stratified work environment and are really actively involved in meeting a workforce that has a less singular way of working.
Yeah, last year when we had this conference, some of our speakers addressed this, working across states. There are a lot of occupations like construction, or even in healthcare, where it's across state lines, and you really have to think about, when you're putting benefits together, the resources that are local and how to make it all equitable. It's a real challenge, especially with multinational companies, to make this work, and fairness and justice and equality. So yeah, well, I think we're at time. It was a heroic effort, and you did a fabulous job. So thank you so much, and thank you to all the participants who were so kind and supportive. It was a great talk, and we'll give you 5-minute break now, and we'll come back to join for the next session here. So thank you so much, Sierra. We really appreciate it. Bye-bye.